The spears came up before I even finished my sentence. 6 guards, tall and gray-skinned, snapped their weapons toward my chest the moment I pointed at her. I did not move. I had a sidearm on my hip and a warship in orbit that could turn this entire palace into dust in under a minute, and every single person in that hall knew it. So I stood there, calm, while the points of 6 spears hovered close enough that I could see my own reflection in the metal. The throne room had gone silent except for the hum of the translation device clipped to my collar. A moment ago it had been full of music and careful diplomatic laughter. Now nobody was laughing. My name is Ethan Cole. 3 days earlier I had been a translator and liaison officer aboard the human warship Meridian, the only human ship most of these people had ever seen. We had not come looking for a fight. We had answered a distress signal from a smaller empire being crushed by a larger one, and within an hour of arriving, the larger empire, the Savari Dominion, had surrendered every world it had taken. Not because we destroyed their fleet. We did not have to. One scan of our ship's output told their engineers everything they needed to know about how outmatched they were. Their war ended before it really began. That should have been the end of my involvement. Soldiers do not usually attend royal court ceremonies. But Commander Holt had insisted I come, since I was the only one on the ship who had bothered to learn their language properly, instead of relying only on the translator, and someone needed to stand in the hall and represent humanity while the treaty was finalized. Nobody warned me about the tradition. After the formal surrender, the Dominion's chancellor, a thin, sharp-voiced alien named Braille, stood and announced that it was custom, ancient and unbreakable, for the defeated side to offer the victorious side a bond of peace through marriage. A princess of the royal line would be given to seal the treaty. I remember laughing under my breath, certain this was a joke, until I saw the seriousness on every face around me. Then they paraded the princesses in. There were 9 of them, each one announced with a long string of titles, each one dressed in fabrics that looked like they cost more than my entire ship's maintenance budget. Ivara, second daughter of the emperor, famous across 3 star systems for her diplomatic victories. Thessia, a war hero in her own right, who had led fleets before she turned 20. One after another, the chancellor listed achievements, bloodlines, and honors, clearly expecting me to be dazzled. I was not dazzled. I was uncomfortable. The whole thing felt like livestock being shown at an auction, except the livestock were people, and they all wore the same practiced smile, the same desperate hope that I would choose them and save their families from the embarrassment of being passed over. I scanned the row of princesses, trying to figure out a polite way to say I did not want to choose any of them at all, when I noticed something odd. Off to the side, almost behind a pillar, stood a 10th woman nobody had introduced. She wore plain gray, instead of the bright ceremonial colors the others had. Her head was down. She was clearly trying to be invisible. I asked Chancellor Braille who she was. The hall went quiet in a different way this time. Braille's throat made a clicking sound, the Savari equivalent of clearing one's throat in discomfort. "That is Leora," he said carefully. "She is not part of the presentation." "Why not?" I asked. "Because," Braille said, choosing his words like he was walking across thin ice. "She carries no honor to offer. Her mother fell from favor many years ago. Leora has no titles, no victories, no value to bring to a bond such as this. It would be an insult to suggest she stand among her sisters." I looked at her again. She still had not lifted her head, but I saw her shoulders tense slightly when Braille said the word insult, like she had heard that word applied to herself so many times that it no longer surprised her, only tired her further. Something about that stillness caught me. Not pity, I want to be clear about that, because pity was not what I felt standing in that hall. It was something closer to recognition. I had grown up the youngest of 4 in a family that never had much money, the one nobody expected anything from, the one teachers forgot to call on. I knew what it looked like to stand in a room where everyone had already decided you did not matter. "Bring her forward," I said. Braille blinked all 3 of his eyelids at once, a gesture I would later learn meant extreme distress. "Soldier," he said, "you misunderstand. She is not eligible. Please, allow me to introduce Ivara again. Her accomplishments are considerable. Her diplomatic record alone." "I am not interested in her diplomatic record," I said. "I want to know why an entire royal family decided one of its own daughters does not deserve to stand in a line with her sisters." That is when Leora finally lifted her head. Her eyes were a pale gold color, sharp and alert, in a way that did not match the defeated posture of her body. For just a second, before she caught herself, I saw something flash across her face. Not gratitude, Suspicion. Like she assumed I was setting up some kind of trap, that no outsider asks a question like that without an angle. That suspicion told me more about her life than any title ever could have. The Emperor, an old, heavy alien wrapped in deep red robes, finally spoke from his throne, his voice low and displeased. "Soldier Cole," he said, "my chancellor speaks truth. The girl is unfit for such an honor. Her mother disgraced this house. The girl herself has spent her life in the Eastern Archive halls, cataloging old records, far from court life. She has no combat training, no diplomatic record, no allies among the noble houses. To select her would be seen across the Dominion and across every neighboring power watching this treaty as a deliberate insult to my empire." I thought about that for a moment. Then I looked past the Emperor, past the nervous chancellor, and out toward the tall windows of the throne room, where I could just make out the curve of the meridian in high orbit, a silver shape against the stars, more powerful than every ship this empire had left combined. "With respect, Your Majesty," I said, "I did not arrive here looking for the most celebrated daughter in your house. I came here because my ship answered a call for help, and I ended a war I did not ask to be part of. If your custom requires me to choose someone, then I am going to choose the person standing in this room who has clearly never been chosen for anything in her life. I am choosing her," I said, and pointed at Leora. That is when the spears came up. I held my ground. My pulse was loud in my own ears, but I kept my voice level, because I had learned a long time ago that the moment you show fear to people who are already afraid of you, things get unpredictable fast, and unpredictable is the last thing this fragile peace needed. In the silence that followed, I thought briefly about how strange it was that a single sentence, spoken in a foreign tongue I had only learned out of stubborn curiosity during the long months of transit to this system, could change the temperature of an entire room so completely. I had practiced that language during quiet shifts on the Meridian, more out of boredom than ambition, never imagining it would one day matter this much. "Lower your weapons," the Emperor finally said, his voice tight with something between anger and disbelief. The guards obeyed instantly, stepping back into formation along the walls, though their eyes stayed locked on me. Leora had not moved at all during any of this. She stood frozen at the edge of the room, staring at me like I had just done something either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, and she had not yet decided which. Chancellor Braille approached me slowly, his hands raised in a gesture I assumed was meant to be calming. "Soldier Cole," he said quietly, "please reconsider. This choice will be seen by every power in this sector as either madness or insult. It will create chaos you cannot imagine. I beg you, choose differently." I looked at Leora one more time. She still had not spoken a single word, but there was something in the way she held herself now, spine a little straighter than before, chin lifted just slightly, like some old, buried part of her had decided that if this stranger was going to insist on this insane choice, she was not going to shrink away from it either. "My choice is made," I said. Behind me, I heard the doors of the throne room slam open, and a new voice, harsh and urgent, cut through the tension like a blade. "Chancellor Braille," the voice shouted, "there is a problem in the lower district." The crowds have heard about the human's choice. They are not reacting well. I felt the temperature of the room drop all over again. Whatever I had just started, it was already spreading faster than I could control. Chancellor Braille's aide, a younger official named Turan, was practically shaking as he relayed the reports coming in from the lower district. Word of my choice had spread through the palace staff within minutes, and from there, it had leaked into the streets faster than anyone could contain it. Crowds were gathering outside the eastern gate. Some were curious. Many were furious. A few, according to Torin, were already calling for the guards to seize Leora and lock her away before the human soldier could make things worse. I did not understand the full weight of what I had triggered. Not yet. I knew the Savari Dominion had a rigid system of rank and honor, but I had not understood how deeply that system ran until I watched grown officials, men who had spent decades navigating court politics without flinching, look genuinely terrified by the idea that a low-ranked noble had just been chosen over princesses, with armies and titles behind them. "We need to move her somewhere secure," I said. Braille looked at me like I had grown a second head. "You wish to protect her," he said, as if the idea had not occurred to him until that moment. "Of course I want to protect her," I said. "I chose her. That makes her my responsibility now, whether your customs like it or not." The Emperor, still seated on his throne with his heavy red robes pooling around him, finally rose. "Guards, he said. Escort the soldier and the girl to the western wing. Seal the corridors. No one enters or leaves without my direct order. For the first time since I had pointed at her, Leora spoke. I can walk on my own, she said quietly, when one of the guards reached for her arm to guide her. Her voice was steady, lower than I expected, with a quiet edge of irritation in it that told me she had spent a long time being handled like an object rather than a person, and she was tired of it. The guard hesitated, glanced at Braille for permission, then stepped back. Leora walked forward on her own, falling into step beside me as we moved through a side door and into a narrow corridor lined with old paintings of past emperors. We walked in silence for a while. I could feel her watching me from the corner of her eye, the same suspicious, evaluating look from before. Finally, she spoke again. Why did you choose me? She asked. And do not say it was an act of kindness. I have heard enough kind-sounding lies in this palace to recognize one when it is wrapped in pretty words. I thought about lying anyway, giving her some smooth diplomatic answer that would keep the peace and avoid complications. Instead, I told her the truth. Honestly, I said, I do not know your full story yet, but I watched everyone in that room decide you were worthless before you ever said a single word. And I have spent enough of my life being underestimated to recognize what that feels like from the outside. I was not trying to insult your empire. I was trying not to be part of something that treats people like trophies based on titles they were born into. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, almost to herself, that is either the most foolish reason I have ever heard, or the only honest one anyone in this palace has given me in 15 years. I will let you decide which, I said. For just a second, the corner of her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough that I noticed. We reached the western wing without further incident, but the calm did not last. Within an hour, Braille returned, his expression grim, carrying a data tablet that displayed live feeds from across the capital. Riots had broken out in 3 different districts. Some of the unrest had nothing to do with me at all. Old political grievances bubbling up now that the Empire's military defeat had weakened the Emperor's authority. But a significant part of the chaos centered on one demand, repeated on banners and chanted in the streets. Choose a worthy princess, the crowd shouted. Do not let the unworthy one shame the Empire before the galaxy. I watched the footage with a tightening feeling in my chest. This was not what I had wanted. I had made a choice, based on a single moment of conviction in a throne room, without fully understanding the centuries of tradition I was crashing into. Leora watched the same footage beside me, her face unreadable. They have always hated me, she said quietly. Now they finally have a reason loud enough to say it out loud. I wanted to argue with her, to tell her this was not about her personally, but the words felt hollow even as I considered saying them. So instead I asked her to tell me her story, the real one, not the version the Chancellor had summarized in a few clipped, embarrassed sentences back in the throne room. She studied me for a long moment, as if deciding whether I deserved an answer. Then, slowly, she began to talk. Her mother, she explained, had been a respected noble once, a skilled negotiator who had secured several valuable trade agreements for the Dominion early in her career. But 15 years ago, during a contested succession dispute within the royal family, her mother had publicly supported the wrong candidate for a regional governorship. The candidate lost. Her mother's entire house fell from favor overnight, stripped of titles, land, and influence. Leora, only a child at the time, had inherited that disgrace without ever having a say in the decision that caused it. Since then, she said, I have not been permitted to train in combat, diplomacy, or fleet command, the paths that lead to respect in this empire. I was assigned instead to the archive halls, cataloging old records no one reads, because it was considered a safe place to keep an embarrassment out of sight. You read a lot of old records, I said. All of them, she said, a flicker of something like pride entering her voice for the first time. Every treaty, every war record, every census this empire has produced for the last 300 years. There is very little about Savari history I do not know. Not that anyone has ever asked. I am asking, I said. She looked at me again, and this time the suspicion in her eyes softened just slightly, replaced by something more curious. Before she could respond, the lights in the corridor flickered. I had spent enough time aboard a warship to recognize the particular kind of flicker that meant something was wrong with a power system, not a natural fluctuation. I grabbed Leora's arm and pulled her toward the nearest support pillars just as the wall ahead of us buckled outward in a small, controlled explosion. Smoke filled the corridor. Through the haze, I saw two figures in dark cloaks moving fast, weapons raised, heading directly toward where Leora and I had been standing seconds earlier. "Get behind me," I said, drawing my sidearm. Leora did not argue. She moved quickly, ducking behind the pillar, while I positioned myself between her and the approaching figures. "I am a soldier," I called out to them, in their own language. "Lower your weapons now." The two figures hesitated for half a second, clearly not expecting a human to speak their tongue fluently. Then one of them raised a weapon anyway and fired. I had trained for moments like this more times than I could count. In simulations, in drills, in the brief skirmishes during the short conflict with the Dominion's forces before their surrender. None of that training stopped my heart from slamming against my ribs as the shot cracked past my shoulder, close enough that I felt the heat of it. I returned fire, aiming low, disabling rather than ending, because the last thing this fragile piece needed was a dead body that could be spun into a story about human brutality. My shot struck the attacker's weapon arm, and they dropped their weapon with a sharp cry, stumbling back against the wall. The second attacker turned to run, but palace guards, alerted by the explosion, flooded into the corridor from both ends, cutting off the escape. Within moments, both attackers were restrained. Braille arrived minutes later, out of breath, his three eyelids blinking rapidly as he surveyed the smoke and damage. "Who are they?" I demanded, gesturing toward the captured attackers. One of the palace guards stepped forward, having already searched the prisoners. He held up a small emblem, a stylized claw symbol stitched onto the inside of one attacker's cloak. "The Koran Assembly," the guard said grimly. "They have agents within the capital." I had heard the name Koran Assembly mentioned briefly during diplomatic briefings aboard the Meridian, a rival power on the edge of Savari territory, one that had been quietly expanding its influence while the Dominion was distracted by its war. I had not expected them to act this quickly, or this directly. "Why would they target her?" I asked, nodding toward Leora, who stood pale but composed beside the pillar, watching the scene unfold with sharp, careful eyes. Braille exchanged a look with the lead guard, then answered carefully, "If the Koran Assembly can remove the princess you chose, through violence blamed on internal Savari unrest, they create a crisis. Either your humans retaliate against the Dominion for failing to protect her, breaking this fragile peace, or the Dominion descends further into chaos trying to manage the blame. Either outcome weakens us. Either outcome benefits the Koran Assembly." I felt a cold certainty settle over me. This was no longer a matter of court tradition and wounded pride. Within hours of my choice, outside powers were already moving to exploit it, to turn a single decision in a throne room into a weapon against an entire empire. Leora stepped forward, her voice steady despite everything that had just happened. "Then we cannot simply hide in this wing and wait for the next attempt," she said. "If they know I survived this one, they will try again, more carefully next time." She was right, and I respected her immediately for saying it instead of asking to be tucked away somewhere safe. "I need to contact my commander," I said. "We are not equipped to manage a political crisis of this size with just the two of us and a handful of palace guards." Braille nodded quickly. "I will arrange a secure channel to your ship at once." As the Chancellor hurried off to make arrangements, Leora turned to me, the smoke from the explosion still drifting faintly in the corridor around us. "You did not know any of this would happen when you pointed at me in that hall," she said. It was not quite a question. "No," I admitted. "I did not." "Do you regret it?" she asked. I considered the question carefully before answering, because I owed her an honest answer, not a comforting one. "No," I said finally. "I do not regret choosing you. I regret that choosing you put you in danger you did not ask for. Those are two different things." She studied my face for a long moment, searching for any sign of insincerity, and apparently found none, because the tension in her shoulders eased slightly, just enough for me to notice. "Then we had better make sure your decision was worth the trouble it has caused," she said. For the first time since I had met her, there was the faint trace of a real smile on her face, sharp and a little dangerous, like she had just decided to stop waiting for the universe to discard her, and had chosen, instead, to fight for her own place in it. Behind us, alarms began sounding through the palace, distant at first, then closer, as more reports of unrest poured in from across the capital. Whatever calm I had hoped to find after making my choice, it was clear now that the real challenge was only beginning. Braille returned within the hour, accompanied by a security officer carrying a small case. Inside, he explained, were the personal effects taken from the two captured attackers. He laid the items across a table for me to examine, a habit I recognized from human interrogation procedures, though I suspected the Savari had developed it independently. Among the items was a small data chip, badly damaged in the struggle but not beyond recovery. I asked Braille whether his technicians could extract anything useful from it. "Given time, perhaps," he said, though I suspect whatever instructions it contains were meant to be destroyed the moment their mission concluded. "We do not have time to wait and hope," I said. "My ship has technicians who specialize in exactly this kind of recovery work. With your permission, I would like to send it up to the Meridian." Braille hesitated only briefly before agreeing, and within the hour, a small shuttle carried the chip up to the warship. Leora insisted on accompanying the security detail that escorted it, arguing that her knowledge of Savari encryption standards, gathered from years spent buried in the archive halls, might prove useful in identifying which faction had encoded the data in the first place. She was right. By the time the chip had been partially recovered, she had already recognized the encryption pattern as a variant used almost exclusively by Koran intelligence operatives, a detail the Meridian's own technicians had not yet identified on their own. "You continue to be more useful than anyone in that throne room gave you credit for," I told her, as we waited together for the final extraction results. She did not look up from the datapad in her hands, though I noticed the faint, satisfied set of her jaw. "I have had 15 years of practice noticing details other people overlook," she said. "It turns out that habit has uses beyond cataloging dusty records nobody reads." The recovered data, once fully extracted, confirmed Braille's worst fears. The attack had not been a desperate, improvised response to my choice in the throne room. It had been planned in advance. Contingency orders prepared the moment Koran intelligence learned a human delegation was arriving in Savari space at all, regardless of which princess I might have chosen. Leora's selection had simply provided the opportunity the Koran assembly needed to set their plan into motion. That should have been reassuring, in a strange way, proof that the attack was never truly personal. Instead, it left me with a colder understanding of exactly how carefully the wider galaxy had already been watching us, long before I ever stepped into that crowded hall. Commander Holt's voice came through the secure channel, sharp with controlled tension, the kind of tone I had only heard him use twice before, both times during actual combat. "Cole," he said, "I need you to explain to me, slowly, why half the diplomatic channels in this sector are lighting up with messages about a human soldier rejecting royal princesses in favor of an archivist with no political standing." I gave him the short version, standing in a secure side room off the western wing, while Leora waited nearby, arms crossed, listening to my half of the conversation, with quiet interest. I told him about the ceremony, the tradition, my choice, and the attack in the corridor less than an hour later. There was a long pause on the other end. "Koran assembly agents, inside the Savari capital," Holt finally said. "That is not a coincidence, Cole. That is a message. Stay where you are. I am sending additional security down immediately, and I am pulling every intelligence report we have on Koran activity in this sector." While we waited, Braille returned with updated reports, and the picture that emerged was worse than I had expected. It was not only the Koran assembly paying close attention to events inside the Savari Dominion. Within hours of the throne room ceremony, transmissions had gone out across a dozen neighboring systems, carried by merchant ships, diplomatic couriers, and intercepted military channels. Every power that bordered Savari space, friendly or hostile, now knew that humanity's first official act in this part of the galaxy had been to reject the Empire's most celebrated daughters in favor of its least esteemed one. Nobody knew what to make of it, and that uncertainty was spreading faster than any army could move. I watched, over the following hours, as Braille's communications staff struggled to keep up with incoming messages. A neighboring trade alliance demanded clarification on whether humans honored noble bloodlines at all, worried that future negotiations with us would ignore their carefully built hierarchies of status. A smaller independent system, one that had quietly suffered under Savari expansion for decades, sent a message praising my choice as proof that humans valued individuals over inherited privilege, and asked whether we might be willing to support their own bid for independence. Even more concerning were the silent responses, the powers that sent nothing at all, choosing instead to watch and wait, recalculating what they thought they understood about the species that had just ended a war without firing more than a handful of shots. Later that evening, while Braille's staff continued sorting through the flood of incoming messages, Leora led me to a quiet reading room tucked away in the western wing, one she said had once belonged to her mother, before the disgrace that ended her family's standing. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old data crystals and physical scrolls that looked decades out of date even by Savari standards. "This is where I came whenever the rest of the palace became unbearable," she said, running her fingers along the spines of the old records. "Nobody else wanted these. They were considered relics of a failed house, not worth the effort of cataloging properly. So they let me have them instead, more as punishment than gift, I think." I picked up one of the crystals, turning it over in my hand. "What is on these?" I asked. "Trade records mostly," she said. "Old border disputes. Census data from systems most people have forgotten ever existed. But also," she added, hesitating slightly, "my mother's personal journals, from before everything fell apart. I have read them more times than I can count." I asked her what they said, and for the first time since we had met, she seemed genuinely uncertain whether to answer. "My mother believed status should be earned through action, not inherited through birth," she finally said. It was an unpopular belief, even among her own allies. When she backed the wrong candidate during the succession dispute, those same allies abandoned her instantly, eager to distance themselves from anything that might cost them their own standing. I used to think she was naive for believing what she believed. Now I am no longer certain. "You think she was right," I said. "I think," Leora said carefully, "that until a few days ago, I had never once seen proof that her belief could survive contact with reality. Everyone I have ever known confirmed, again and again, that status determines worth, and that worth without status is meaningless. You are the first person who has acted as though the opposite might be true." I did not have an easy answer for that, so I simply sat with her in the quiet of that forgotten reading room for a while, surrounded by records nobody else had ever cared enough to study, while outside the walls, an entire galaxy continued recalculating what it thought it understood about us both. "You have made yourself a symbol," Leora said quietly, watching the same reports over my shoulder, once we had returned to the main chamber, "whether you intended to or not." "I did not want to be a symbol," I said. "I just wanted to make a decision I could live with." "Sometimes those are the same thing," she said. "The decisions people make when they are not trying to send a message are often the ones that say the most." Before I could respond, one of Braille's aides rushed in, face pale beneath his gray skin. "Chancellor," he said, breathless, "we have intercepted a transmission. Corran Assembly forces are moving a small strike team toward the outer trade station at Velcor Junction. Our intelligence suggests they intend to seize a target traveling through the station within the next 2 days." "What target?" Braille demanded. The aide hesitated, glancing nervously at Leora before answering. "The transmission references the unworthy princess directly," he said. "They intend to capture her, alive if possible, and use her as proof that the Savari Dominion cannot protect even its own people, let alone honor a treaty with a foreign power." The room went quiet. I felt my jaw tighten. "Why Velcor Junction specifically?" I asked. "Why there, if she has not left the capital?" Braille's expression turned grim. "Because," he explained slowly, "the Dominion's Council has already begun discussing plans to relocate Leora to a more secure facility outside the capital, away from the unrest here. The original plan routed her transport directly through Velcor Junction in 3 days. Somehow, the Corran Assembly already knows the route." That meant one of two things. Either the Corran Assembly had extraordinarily good intelligence networks reaching deep into the Dominion's own council, or someone inside the palace itself had leaked the plan deliberately. I did not like either possibility. "We change the route," I said immediately. "Today, before anyone else outside this room knows the new plan." Braille nodded slowly, already reaching for his tablet to begin redrafting the transport orders. But changing a relocation plan, that had already been discussed among council members, would not be simple, and we both knew it. "There is another option," Leora said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. "I have spent 15 years cataloging every record this empire possesses," she said, "including the old smuggler routes and forgotten trade lanes that predate Velcor Junction by over a century. If we used one of those instead of the official corridor, no one outside this room would know our path, because no one outside this room remembers those routes exist." Braille looked skeptical. "Those lanes have not been used in generations," he said. "Some may not even be navigable anymore." "I know exactly which ones are," Leora said, a quiet confidence entering her voice that I had not heard from her before. "I have read every survey report ever filed on them. Give me access to a star chart, and I will plot a route within the hour." I looked at her, genuinely impressed. and for the first time understood, in a small but real way, what the Dominion had thrown away by locking her in an archive hall for 15 years, instead of letting her near any position of real responsibility. She was not simply intelligent. She had spent over a decade absorbing information nobody else valued, and now that knowledge had become the one advantage we had against an enemy who thought they already knew our every move. "Do it," Braille said. Within the hour, Leora had produced a route that wound through 3 abandoned trade lanes, bypassing Velcor Junction entirely, adding extra travel time but avoiding the ambush waiting for us. Commander Holt, once briefed on the plan, agreed to send a small escort team to accompany the transport, along with a handful of Meridian crew members to coordinate security on the human side. I requested to be part of that escort myself. Holt did not argue. I suspect he understood, even before I fully admitted it to myself, that I was no longer simply fulfilling an assigned duty. I had chosen Leora in that throne room, and somewhere in the hours since, that choice had stopped feeling like an obligation, and started feeling like something closer to responsibility I genuinely wanted to carry. The journey began 2 days later, under cover of a manufactured cover story claiming Leora's transport had been delayed due to palace security concerns. In reality, our small convoy slipped out of the capital under the quiet of night, taking the forgotten lanes Leora had charted. For the first several hours, the journey was tense but uneventful. I sat across from Leora in the transport's main cabin, watching her study old star charts on a datapad, occasionally murmuring corrections to our pilot through a comlink. She moved through the information with an ease that made it clear this was, in some strange way, the first time in years she had been allowed to actually use the knowledge she had spent so long gathering. "You enjoy this," I said, more an observation than a question. She glanced up, slightly surprised by the comment. "I enjoy being useful," she said. "For most of my life, I was told my knowledge had no value, because I had no title to attach it to. It is strange, having someone actually rely on it instead of dismissing it." "That is going to keep happening," I said. "As long as I am around, I plan on relying on you a lot." She studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her pale gold eyes. "Why?" she asked quietly. "You barely know me, Ethan Cole. You made a choice in a moment of conviction, but you do not actually know who I am yet." "I am learning quickly," I said, "and so far, everything I am learning tells me my choice was the right one." She did not respond immediately, but she also did not look away, and something about the silence between us felt less guarded than it had back in the palace. The moment was interrupted by a sharp alert from the cockpit. "Unidentified vessel approaching from the starboard side," the pilot announced, tension clear in his voice. "It is matching our course exactly. They should not know we are here." I felt my stomach drop. Somehow, despite the secrecy of our route, despite the forgotten lanes Leora had so carefully chosen, someone had found us anyway. "Identify them," I ordered, moving quickly toward the cockpit, Leora close behind me. The pilot's hands moved rapidly across the console, pulling up the vessel's configuration. The shape that resolved on the display was sleek, fast, clearly built for speed and stealth rather than heavy combat. "Corin Assembly Scout Class," the pilot confirmed grimly. "They are hailing us." "Put it through," I said. The voice that came through the comm was cold and precise, speaking in clipped, formal Savari, with a faint accent I did not recognize. "Human transport," the voice said. "You are carrying cargo claimed by the Corin Assembly. Surrender the passenger known as Leora, and your vessel will be permitted to continue unharmed. Resist, and we will be forced to disable your engines and board by force." I exchanged a glance with the pilot, then keyed the comm myself. "This is Ethan Cole, soldier of the human warship Meridian, currently in orbit of this system," I said, my voice leveled despite the adrenaline beginning to surge through my chest. "The passenger aboard this vessel is under direct human protection as part of an active treaty negotiation. Any attempt to seize her will be treated as a direct act of aggression against humanity, not just the Savari Dominion." There was a pause on the other end, longer than I expected. "Your threats mean little out here, soldier," the voice finally replied, colder than before. "Your warship is in high orbit around the capital, far beyond any reasonable response time. We have already accounted for that distance in our calculations. Surrender the passenger, or we proceed with force." I looked at Leora, standing just behind me, her face pale but composed, that same quiet defiance from the throne room flickering back into her eyes. "I am not surrendering anyone," I said into the comm. my hand already moving toward the weapons control panel built into the transport's modest defense systems. The Corin vessel did not respond with words this time. Instead, the display lit up with a proximity warning, the scout ship surging forward, weapons charging. "Brace for impact," I shouted, just as the first shot streaked across our bow. The shot missed our hull by less than a meter, close enough that the transport shuddered violently from the shockwave. Leora grabbed the edge of a console to steady herself, while I dropped into the secondary weapons seat, pulling up what little firepower our modest vessel actually had. "This transport was built for diplomacy, not combat," the pilot shouted over the rising whine of overworked engines. "We do not have the firepower to outlast a scout ship in a direct fight." "Then we do not fight," I said, scanning the navigation display for anything that could buy us time. "Leora, those old trade lanes, do any of them lead through dense terrain, asteroid fields, anything that could slow a faster ship down?" She was already moving, sliding into the seat beside the pilot, fingers flying across the star chart she had memorized so thoroughly over the previous days. "There," she said, pointing to a cluster of markers on the display. "An old asteroid belt, remnants of a destroyed moon from centuries ago. The official records listed as impassable for modern vessels, due to debris density, which is exactly why no one patrols it anymore. If our pilot is skilled enough, we can use it." "I am skilled enough," the pilot said through gritted teeth, already adjusting our course. The transport banked hard, engines screaming as we dove toward the asteroid field. Behind us, the Corin scout ship matched our turn effortlessly, clearly built for exactly this kind of pursuit, gaining ground with every passing second. Another shot grazed our shields, sending sparks scattering across the cockpit console. I gripped the edge of my seat, watching Leora's face as she called out, "Navigation adjustments in rapid succession," her voice steady despite the chaos around us. "Hard to port, now!" she shouted, and the pilot obeyed instantly, swinging us between two massive chunks of rock, just as another shot streaked past where we had been a moment before. We plunged deeper into the asteroid field, the Corin scout ship following close behind, but I noticed its movements becoming less precise, less confident, as the debris grew denser around us. Their ship was faster, but ours, guided by Leora's near-perfect memory of survey data nobody else had bothered to study in decades, was finding paths through gaps the enemy pilot could not anticipate. "There," Leora called out, pointing to a narrow channel between two enormous rock formations. "It is tight, but the survey data says it is stable. Take it now." The pilot did not hesitate. Our transport shot through the gap with barely a meter of clearance on either side. Behind us, I heard a tremendous impact, followed by static across the comm channels, as the pursuing scout ship, attempting the same maneuver at higher speed, clipped one of the rock formations and spun out of control, venting atmosphere from a damaged section of its hull. "We are clear!" the pilot announced, breathless, as the asteroid field opened back up into empty space ahead of us. "Corin vessel is disabled, drifting. They will not be catching up to us anytime soon." I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, slumping back in my seat. Beside me, Leora did the same, her hands trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "That was either the bravest or the most reckless thing I have ever done," she said quietly. "I think it might have been both," I said. For a moment, despite everything, we both laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from surviving something that should not have been survivable. The relief did not last long. Within minutes, an urgent message came through from Commander Holt, who had been monitoring the situation from the Meridian the entire time, unable to intervene directly due to the distance Leora had correctly noted earlier. "Cole," Holt said, voice tight with concern. "I want full reports the moment you reach the secure facility. And Cole, that was good thinking back there, using old survey routes the enemy could not anticipate. Make sure whoever provided that intelligence gets proper credit." I glanced at Leora, who was staring out the viewport at the stars beyond, still catching her breath. "I will make sure of it," I said. We reached the secure facility, a fortified outpost on the edge of Dominion territory, without further incident. The outpost itself was smaller than I expected, a cluster of reinforced structures built into the side of a rocky ridge, manned by a modest garrison of Savari soldiers, who greeted our arrival with a mixture of relief and obvious nerves. News of the Corin ambush had reached them ahead of us, and I could see it in the way they kept glancing toward the sky, half expecting another attack to drop out of orbit at any moment. I spent the first day working alongside the garrison commander, a steady, no-nonsense officer named Vetra, to reinforce the outpost's defenses. Leora, rather than retreating somewhere quiet to recover from the ordeal, insisted on reviewing the facility's old survey records as well, identifying 2 additional access points the original builders had sealed off generations earlier, but never fully removed from the station's blueprints. "If the Koran Assembly attempts another strike here," she explained, pointing to the forgotten passages on a holographic map, "these are the routes they are most likely to use, precisely because your current security plans do not account for them." Vetra studied the map for a long moment, then nodded slowly, clearly impressed despite himself. "I have commanded this outpost for 6 years," he admitted. "I did not know those passages existed." "It is in the original construction records," Leora said simply. "Filed under maintenance access, 312 years ago. No one has updated the security protocols to reflect changes made since." By the end of that first day, the outpost's defenses had been quietly but significantly improved, thanks largely to knowledge that had spent over a decade sitting forgotten in an archive nobody bothered to visit. I found myself, more than once, simply watching Leora work, struck by how naturally she had stepped into a role no one had ever offered her the chance to occupy before. The danger, I quickly realized, was not only external. Word of the attack reached the capital almost as fast as we did, and with it came a fresh wave of political maneuvering that proved far more dangerous, in its own quiet way, than the Koran scout ship had been. 3 days after our arrival at the outpost, Chancellor Braille arrived in person, accompanied by a delegation from the capital, including a face I did not recognize. A tall, severe-looking Savari noble, introduced as Prince Kessin, the Emperor's eldest nephew, and a powerful voice within the royal council. "Soldier Cole," Prince Kessin said, his tone polite, but edged with something colder beneath the surface. "The council has met to discuss recent events. Given the attack on Velcor Junction's intended route, and the clear danger surrounding Leora's continued presence near the human delegation, the council believes it would be wisest to relocate her to a quiet, secure estate, far from court, and arrange for a more suitable princess to fulfill the treaty's requirements in her place." I felt my jaw tighten. "You are asking me to change my choice," I said flatly. "We are asking you to consider the safety and stability of 2 empires," Prince Kessin replied smoothly. "Leora has already nearly been killed once because of this arrangement. A more experienced princess, with proper security training and established political alliances, would face far less risk and would strengthen the treaty considerably in the eyes of our neighbors." I looked past him to where Leora stood near the back of the room, her expression carefully neutral, though I could see the old, familiar tension returning to her shoulders, the bracing posture of someone who had spent her entire life expecting to be discarded the moment she became inconvenient. "Let me be very clear," I said, turning back to Prince Kessin. "My choice was not a tactical decision based on convenience or political alliances. I chose Leora because, in a room full of people calculating their own advantage, she was the only one who had been denied the chance to prove what she was capable of, simply because of circumstances she had no control over. Since that moment, she has personally saved both our lives by recalling navigation data no one else in this empire bothered to remember existed. I do not see a liability standing in this room, Prince Kessin. I see exactly the kind of person my choice was meant to honor in the first place." The room went quiet. Braille shifted uncomfortably, glancing between me and the prince, clearly unsure how to navigate the tension building between us. Prince Kessin's expression hardened. "You misunderstand the stakes, soldier," he said, his polite tone slipping slightly. "This is not merely a matter of personal preference. The stability of an entire empire depends on this treaty being seen as legitimate, as honorable, by every power watching. A misstep here could unravel everything your warship accomplished by ending our war in the first place." "Then let me explain something about my species that your empire seems to be struggling with," I said, stepping forward. "Humans do not measure worth by bloodline or by titles handed down through inheritance. We measure it by what a person chooses to do when given the chance. Leora has been given almost nothing her entire life, and she has still managed to become someone capable of outsmarting a trained Koran strike team, using nothing but knowledge everyone else considered worthless. If your empire cannot see the value in that, then perhaps the problem is not my choice. Perhaps the problem is the system that decided she had no value to begin with." Prince Kessin's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the Emperor's voice came through a secure comm channel that had been quietly listening to the entire exchange, his tone heavy with something that sounded surprisingly like reluctant respect. "Enough," the Emperor said. "Nephew, The soldier's choice stands. I will not risk further insult to the humans by attempting to reverse a decision already witnessed by half the capital. The treaty proceeds with Leora as agreed. Prince Kessen's expression flickered with frustration, quickly masked behind practiced diplomatic composure. "As you command, my emperor," he said stiffly, before turning and leaving the room without another word, his delegation following close behind. Once the room had emptied, Leora finally moved, crossing the space between us with quick, deliberate steps. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly. "Defend me so directly, in front of the prince himself. It would have been easier, politically, to simply agree with him." "Easier is not the same as right," I said. "And besides, I told you back on the transport. I plan on relying on you. That is not something I am willing to negotiate away just because it makes a prince uncomfortable." She studied my face for a long moment, something shifting behind her pale gold eyes, the last traces of that old, defensive suspicion, finally giving way to something steadier, something that looked, for the first time, like genuine trust. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not for choosing me in that throne room. For choosing to keep choosing me, every time someone has tried to convince you otherwise." I did not have a clever response to that, so I simply nodded, and for a moment, standing in that quiet room, far from the chaos of the capital, it felt like the political storm outside had finally, briefly, gone still. That stillness, however, would not last. Even as Prince Kessen's delegation departed the outpost, reports were already filtering in from deeper within Dominion space, and from beyond its borders entirely, suggesting that the chaos surrounding my choice had grown far larger than a single rival prince or a single failed Corran ambush. Entire fleets, belonging to powers neither of us had even considered yet, were beginning to move. Commander Holt summoned me back to the Meridian, less than a day after Prince Kessen's delegation departed, and the moment I stepped onto the bridge, I understood that whatever calm I had felt at the outpost was about to be tested, far beyond anything we had faced so far. "A Corran assembly battle fleet has entered the outer edge of Savari space," Holt said, gesturing toward the main display, where a cluster of red markers hovered just beyond the system's border. 12 warships, configured for a serious engagement, not a scouting mission. Their official communication claims they are responding to, and I am quoting directly here, "an unprovoked attack on a Corran vessel by human and Savari forces near Velcor Junction." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. "They are twisting the ambush into justification for an invasion," I said. "That is exactly what they are doing," Holt confirmed grimly. "And it is working. 3 neighboring systems have already begun mobilizing their own defense forces, uncertain whether this is the start of a larger Corran expansion or a test of how humanity responds when an ally is directly threatened." Leora, who had accompanied me back to the Meridian at my request, stepped forward, studying the fleet positions on the display with the same intense focus she had shown analyzing star charts days earlier. "This is not truly about the ambush," she said. "The Corran Assembly has wanted greater influence over this region for decades. Your arrival, and the speed of Savari's surrender, frightened every power nearby. They are using this incident as cover to test exactly how far humanity is willing to go to protect an ally, before committing to anything larger." Holt studied her for a long moment, clearly reassessing his earlier assumptions about the archivist princess I had chosen in a throne room days before. "She is not wrong," he said finally. "Cole, I want her included in our strategic briefings going forward. Her knowledge of this region has already proven more valuable than 3 intelligence reports combined." Leora glanced at me, a flicker of quiet surprise crossing her face at being taken seriously by a human commander without hesitation, without the careful, condescending caveats she had spent her entire life hearing from her own people. Over the following hours, the situation escalated rapidly. The Corran fleet advanced deeper into the system, broadcasting demands for the Savari Dominion to formally apologize for the Velcor Junction incident, surrender Leora into Corran custody as compensation, and renegotiate the treaty terms under Corran oversight. The Emperor, watching his fragile peace threaten to collapse entirely, contacted Commander Holt directly, his voice strained with the weight of a ruler watching everything slip out of his control. "Commander," the Emperor said, "perhaps it would be wisest to consider the Corran demands. A single individual, against the stability of an entire region, the calculation seems clear." I felt anger flare in my chest before Holt even had a chance to respond, and I stepped forward without waiting to be invited into the conversation. "With respect, Your Majesty," I said, That calculation only seems clear if you believe individuals are expendable in service of stability. Humanity does not operate that way. We did not end your war by calculating which losses were acceptable. We ended it because we chose to act, decisively, the moment we saw injustice happening in front of us. We are not going to abandon that principle now simply because the threat has grown larger. Holt nodded firmly beside me. The soldier speaks for the Meridian's position as well, Your Majesty, he said. Humanity does not negotiate the safety of an ally under threat, regardless of how that ally came to be chosen. The Emperor was silent for a long moment, before finally sighing, an old, weary sound. Then prepare your defenses, Commander, he said quietly. I will not be the one to abandon the only honest decision made in my court in 15 years, regardless of the cost. The Meridian moved into position alongside the remaining Savari defense fleet, a small but determined force, compared to the 12 Koran warships advancing toward the capital. I stood on the bridge beside Leora, watching the tactical display as the two fleets closed the distance, my chest tight with an anticipation I had felt only a handful of times before in actual combat. They likely expect a single human warship to act recklessly, attacking before properly assessing the situation, Leora said quietly, studying the Koran fleet's formation. Their ships are positioned defensively, prepared to retreat and use any aggressive human action as further justification for their narrative. Then we do not give them that justification, I said, glancing at Holt. Holt nodded slowly. Open a channel to the Koran fleet commander, he ordered. The Koran commander's image appeared on the display moments later, a tall, severe figure with cold, calculating eyes that studied our small combined fleet with obvious skepticism. Commander Holt, the Koran commander said, your forces are vastly outnumbered. Surrender the human passenger known as Leora, and withdraw your support of this treaty, and we will allow your ship safe passage out of this system. Holt's expression remained calm, almost bored, despite the 12 warships arrayed against our handful. We are not here to negotiate a surrender, Commander, he said. We are here to inform you that any further aggressive movement toward Savari territory will be treated as a direct act of war against humanity, not simply against this regional power. The Koran commander's composure flickered slightly. Your single ship cannot realistically threaten a fleet of this size, he said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty now. I do not need to threaten your fleet, Commander, Holt replied calmly. I need only inform you that the Meridian has already transmitted a full record of this engagement, including your fabricated justification regarding the Velcor Junction incident, to every major power monitoring this region, along with a formal request for human reinforcements should this situation escalate further. Within 6 hours, this system will no longer contain a single human warship facing your fleet. It will contain considerably more than that, should you choose to proceed with this aggression. A tense silence followed, the Koran commander clearly recalculating his entire approach, as the weight of Holt's words settled in. I glanced at Leora, who watched the exchange with sharp, focused attention, clearly understanding, perhaps better than anyone else in that system, exactly how dangerous it was for any power to misjudge what humanity was actually willing to do in defense of a single principle. Finally, the Koran commander spoke again, his tone considerably more measured than before. Perhaps, he said carefully, this situation has been overstated on both sides. We will withdraw our fleet, pending a formal review of the Velcor Junction incident, conducted jointly between Koran and Savari representatives. That is acceptable, Holt said evenly, though I noticed the slight relief in his posture as the tension on the bridge began, finally, to ease. The Koran fleet withdrew from Savari space over the following hours, their warships retreating back beyond the system's border, the immediate threat dissolving as quickly as it had appeared. But I understood, standing there on the bridge watching the red markers fade from the display, that the danger had not truly disappeared. It had simply been postponed, reshaped into something quieter, more careful, as every power in the region recalculated exactly what they thought they understood about humanity's limits. In the days that followed, the formal review of the Velcor Junction incident concluded exactly as expected, confirming the Koran Assembly's strike team had acted without proper authorization, and the immediate crisis quietly resolved into a fragile but stable peace. The Savari Dominion's treaty with humanity held, strengthened, if anything, by the events of the previous weeks rather than weakened by them. The review itself took place in the same throne room where everything had begun, though the atmosphere this time was markedly different. Where once the hall had been filled with careful, calculating smiles and rigid displays of inherited status, Now the gathered nobles watched with something closer to genuine uncertainty, unsure how to categorize a future their old assumptions no longer seemed to explain. Prince Kessin attended the review as well, though his earlier hostility had cooled into something more guarded, more careful. When the council formally acknowledged Leora's contribution in plotting the route that had avoided the original ambush, and again in identifying the navigation channel that disabled the pursuing Corin scout ship, he offered her a stiff, formal nod of acknowledgement, the closest thing to an apology his pride would likely ever allow. "It does not erase 15 years, Leora said quietly to me afterward, watching the prince depart the hall, "but it is more than I expected to receive in a single afternoon." The emperor, for his part, surprised everyone by formally restoring her family's standing within the royal house before the review concluded, citing her direct role in preserving both the treaty and the lives of those who carried it. It was not the same as the status her sisters had been born into, and would never fully be, but it was, for the first time in 15 years, an acknowledgement that came without conditions attached. "I do not require restored titles to know my own worth any longer," Leora told the council, when asked to respond to the emperor's decision. "But I will accept this gesture, on behalf of the mother whose belief in earned status this empire once tried so hard to bury." The hall remained silent for a long moment after she spoke, before the emperor himself, slowly, deliberately, inclined his head toward her, a gesture of respect I suspected very few in that room had ever seen him offer to anyone outside his immediate bloodline. Leora and I stood together on a balcony overlooking the capital several days later, watching the city slowly return to its usual rhythm below us, the unrest that had erupted after my choice in the throne room finally settling into something quieter, something closer to grudging acceptance. "They are still afraid of you," Leora said, glancing at me. "Not of your weapons, of how unpredictable your choices are. An empire that values bloodline and inherited status above all else has no defense against a species that simply does not care about either." "Good," I said. "Maybe that fear will make them think twice before treating people like trophies the next time." She smiled then, a real smile, unguarded in a way I had not seen from her since the moment we first met in that crowded throne room. "It is strange," she said quietly. 15 years, I was told I had no value to offer anyone. And then a stranger from another galaxy entirely looked at me and decided otherwise, simply because he refused to accept the reasoning everyone else had already agreed upon. "I did not just decide you had value," I said, turning to face her fully. "I recognized it. There is a difference." She studied my face for a long moment, the distant city lights reflecting in her pale gold eyes, before finally speaking again, her voice quieter than before, almost uncertain in a way that felt entirely new for someone who had spent so long guarding herself against disappointment. "What happens now?" she asked. "Once the treaty is finalized, once the diplomatic dust finally settles, does your interest in me end with the politics that created it?" I thought about that question carefully, because I understood exactly what it meant to her, given everything she had survived. "My interest in you," I said slowly, "never had anything to do with the politics in the first place. That was simply the door it walked through." She did not respond immediately, but the careful distance she had maintained since that first conversation in the palace corridor, finally, fully dissolved, replaced by something steadier, something that looked, for the first time, like someone who had decided to stop waiting to be discarded, and had chosen, instead, to believe she belonged exactly where she stood. Word of everything that had happened, the choice in the throne room, the ambush at the asteroid field, the standoff with the Corin fleet, continued to spread across the wider galaxy in the weeks that followed, reaching powers far beyond the borders of Savari space. Every account told the same essential story, reshaped slightly, depending on who was telling it, but always circling back to the same unsettling conclusion. Humanity did not operate according to the rules every other power in the galaxy had spent centuries building their societies around. We did not value inherited status, polished reputations, or careful political calculation above the simple question of whether something was right. And that, more than any warship, more than any show of overwhelming military strength, was what truly unsettled the powers watching from the shadows of distant systems. A single human warship had arrived, ended a war within hours, and then, almost as an afterthought, dismantled an entire empire's rigid hierarchy of worth, simply by choosing the one person everyone else had already decided did not matter. If that was what humanity considered an afterthought, then every power in the galaxy now understood, with growing unease, that they had no real understanding at all of what we might choose to do next, should we ever decide something truly mattered. Standing on that balcony beside Leora, watching the city lights stretch out toward the horizon, I understood that this was only the beginning. Humanity's quiet arrival in this part of the galaxy had not simply ended one war. It had introduced an entirely new kind of uncertainty into a galaxy that had spent centuries believing it understood exactly how power, status, and value were supposed to work. The nightmare the galaxy now faced was not the threat of human weapons, or human warships, or human military strength. It was the much quieter, far more unsettling realization that humanity simply refused to play by anyone else's rules at all.